journalist. He is the editorial page editor of Turkish Daily News, which is one English-speaking Turkish newspaper. And he has also written for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, various He's also an author of a book on the Kurdish question. Mustafa, please. Thank you.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. We're in the middle of that. And first of all, many thanks to Hans and Eugene for organizing this event and having me here. It's really very interesting, meeting and very interesting talks. Well, my topic is the Ottoman Empire and Turkey and the Kurdish question, and I think I should first a little bit touch upon what the Ottoman Empire was. I'm sure you're all familiar with it and you know about it, but let me see how I see the Ottoman Empire and how I see the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, which I see as a very crucial phenomenon which explains many things we have in Turkey today, many problems we have in Turkey today, including the Kurdish issue. Well, the Ottoman Empire was a very long-lived empire. It lasted for a bit more than 6 centuries, and from the late 13th century to basically 1922, or the end of or even 1924. 1922 would be the end of the Ottoman Sultanate, so it's lasted for a long time, and it's ruled much of what we call the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa today, including this piece of land called Anatolia that we are now in. And one of the remarkable things about the Ottoman Empire, I mean, there are things to criticize the empire for many various reasons. I think one of the remarkable virtues of the empire was that it was pluralist. It was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire. Well, many empires like that already, but not all. And especially in the Middle Ages in Europe, states used to impose their beliefs, their identity on people, like we saw in Catholic Spain. The Catholic king of Spain tried to convert all citizens to Catholicism. Whereas in the Ottoman Empire, it was accepted that Jews and Christians at different faiths, or different ethnicities for that matter, were there, and they had their space and they were accepted. And this actually comes from the basic teaching of Islam, which respects Judaism and Christianity, although they're seen somewhat like not as good as Islam, but still they're said, well, there is some truth in those traditions, so they are accepted to exist. And the Ottomans accepted Jews and Christian, different Christian denominations. We had the Orthodox, we had the Greek Armenian, Greeks, the Armenian different churches. They accepted their existence and they lived under the Ottoman Empire. And actually, interestingly, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they came, not too surprisingly, to the Ottoman Empire, which again welcomed the Jews and gave them space. Of course, they were not equal citizens until the 19th century. I mean, the traditional Islamic law regarded Jews and Christians as zimmis, which means they're protected, but somewhat second class. But they were even given equal citizenship in the 19th century Ottoman reforms, which brought in many ideas from the West, like constitutionalism, like legalism, and the idea of equal citizenship. And under the Ottoman Empire, I think that that's an important thing we should know. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was, in some ways, a pre-modern empire, from one perspective. But the other thing is, the empire started to modernize itself from the 18th century on. And especially in the 19th century, there were many legal reforms. And Ottomans tried to learn about Western ideas. Why we had debates about socialist and free markets, as the next speaker will touch upon and will explain it to us in a better way. There were debates between French Enlightenment and the British way of modernization, for example. Some Ottoman intellectuals were more inspired by the British liberal tradition. Others were more influenced by the French revolutionary, the Jacobin tradition of an enlightenment imposed on the society, for example. So there were all different sorts of debates. In the Ottoman Empire, we had a liberal party, the Ahrar party, which means freedoms in Turkish, was right there before Turkish Republic. we had to go to feminist clubs. So the modernization of the empire started, and that's why the Ottoman Empire became a constitutional monarchy in 1870. This is important because the official Turkish history of the Republic depicts the Ottoman Empire as a dark age, and then the Republic came us and shone like a star or a sun and just enlightened all of us, but before it was darkness, which is not true. And of course, the Republic brought in many reforms and continued modernization, but there's a history of that. It did not come into being ex nihilo. Now, of course, this multi-ethnic and multi-religious of the structure of the Ottoman Empire started to crumble down, started to disintegrate in the 19th century, basically because of nationalism. And first, the Balkan minorities, the Muslim minorities of Balkans, they started national revolts against the empire, the Serbians and the Greeks, and they gained their nation states. So the empire started to retreat because of that. And actually, nationalism explains both the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the modern Turkish nation state. And the great tragedy that befell on Armenians in 1915, which is very much debated right now in Turkey and all around, is a product of not the Ottoman system, but a product of the fall of the Ottoman system. Because the Armenians existed under the Ottoman rule for 6 centuries, they were happy and no problem. Actually, the Ottomans defined the Armenians as the loyal nation. But when Armenian nationalism came in with Russian support, you had a reaction to this nationalism. And in the war years, during World War I, especially in the fateful year of 1915, you had an Armenian nationalism coming in and a backlash against it by the central government, which led to the deportation of Armenians and which led to horrible tragedy, for sure. But it was because of the fall of the system. And what happened was that during the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, there were different ideological trends. One was called Ottomanism. And the Ottomanist trends were saying, well, we are all equal citizens. Let's just emphasize equal citizenship for all citizens. Let's try to keep with the Ottomanist model. The other idea was Islamism, which was much more refined and sophisticated than today's Islamic fundamentals or radicalists. And it was a way of saying, well, the Christian nations will go. I mean, there's no way to keep them down, keep them in the empire. But let's emphasize Islam as a unifying bond between different Islamic ethnicities of the empire. And there was Turkism as a third element. And the Turkists said that, well, Turks are really the core of the empire. And others will go. I mean, Arabs will go, and Albanians will go. So just let's really emphasize the Turkishness element. And you had debates and rivalry between these two groups. Well, Ottomanism died off a little bit earlier because it was obvious that you couldn't keep the Greeks or the Serbians or the Bulgarians, and especially after the Balkan Wars, in which many Balkan nations fought against the Ottoman Empire. Ottomanism wasn't holding, but then you had these debates between maybe Islamists and Turkists. And of course, there were different shades and grades between these groups. And what happened was, when the Turkish Republic was founded after a war of liberation against the occupying powers, because Turkey was occupied. Turkey, first of all, entered World War I on the side of Germany, and the Axis powers lost the war, and after the war, Turkey was occupied by Greece, partly by British, and Istanbul was under British occupation. So the Turks, and actually all the groups in Anatolia, fought a war of liberation against these powers. And then Turkey was, and we won the war of liberation. We mean the Turks. And the Turkey people, I mean the old Turks. And the war was won, and the Turkish Republic was proclaimed in 1923. And I think there's a fateful point here. The Turkish War of Liberation was not led by a revolutionary committee or something. It was led by the parliaments, the Turkish Parliament of Turkey, not Turkish, but Parliament of Turkey, which included Turks, Kurds, some Arabs, which were still in the Anatolian land, and all sorts of different people, like some imams, some very secular people. It was a pluralist parliament, which really represented the whole nation, if you will. And in the parliament, you had two different, over time, there emerged two different trends. One was called the first group, the other one was called the second group. And the first group was very much tied to the persona of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Turkey's founder, the first president. The second group was ideologically a bit more different. They were still fighting for independence, but they had a different point of view. And soon, the first group turned into the People's Republican Party, CHP, the Turkish initials. And its leader was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but he was not called Atatürk at the time. He was called Mustafa Kemal Pasha, General Mustafa Kemal. And the second group was not really on the same page, and it was, over time, it turned into be led by Kazım Karabekir, which was another general, but it was a difficult position. And in 1923, the CHP was there, and in 1924, the second group turned into another party called Terakkiperver Fırka in Turkish, or the Progressive Party. So what you basically have is two different parties emerged after the War of Liberation. And the CHP was very much influenced by what I would call Enlightenment fundamentalism. It's the same idea of the French revolutionaries, that you need, in order to modernize, you need to create a homogeneous nation. All ethnic differences should be swept aside. You should homogenize the language. You should get rid of religion and tradition as much as you can, because religion is by definition backwards from that. And freedom is good, but unless you achieve this modernity, freedom is bad. So you have to postpone freedom to a point in which you convert everybody to what you want. And if you can turn people into new human beings, freedom is good. But till that point, you cannot really accept freedom or democracy or democratic order. That was the CHP idea, which came from, well, from the Jacobin tradition, obviously. And then there was the other party, the second party, the Progressive Party. Well, they were not inspired by this vision. They were, first of all, not that much in focus on the state as a agent of modernity. They were believing in free markets. They wrote a program in 1924. There was emphasis on free markets. They were more influenced by the British tradition of modernization, in which tradition and religion is not seen as an enemy, but it just continues along the way as you modernize and you harmonize these tradition and modernity. And they were interestingly interested in integrating the Kurds into Turkey. Kazım Karabekir, the leader of the party, wrote a Kurdish report in 1924. Well, it was a report on the Kurds. And I will come to who the Kurds are, but just so we understand. He said, well, we should integrate the Kurds through agriculture, through fostering trade in that region, and through spreading education, and through emphasizing the common traditional values religious bonds between Turks and Kurds. Whereas the CHP, the Jacobin party, the Kemalist party, was speaking about Turkifying the Kurds, and they did. What happened was that there was indeed a Kurdish revolt in 1925, a big Kurdish revolt, and the CHP, first of all, crushed the revolt, and then closed down the second progressive party, the Bolshevik party, and established a single-party regime, as we call it in Turkey. The single-party regime is actually a euphemism for, truly speaking, dictatorship. And not just the second party, but all civil society was crushed. I mean, Sufi orders were already closed down, even Freemasonry clubs were closed down, feminist orders were closed down. Everything outside of state structure were basically closed down because they believed in the principle of that states should really guide the whole society, and the state knows everything, and the state should really manage the whole society. And in the 30s, this trend, this authoritarian tradition became even much more solidified, because in the 30s was a time in which you had a pretty authoritarian Europe. Nazi Germany was rising, Mussolini was there. Well, Soviet Union wasn't doing bad, seemingly, but it's 5-year plans and so on. And the Turkish strategic politics, independent ideas from European concerns. We had this crisis in 2022, in which Turkey was in pretty good number, because of the situation. And Turkey declared to be the seed race of the Aryan nation. And the size of the Turkish skull was greatly discussed. So some obvious racist ideas were there. Well, what happened was that these ideas didn't prevail that much, but their traces are still there, and that's why still you have a very vibrant nationalism in Turkey, and the state thinks nationalism is a great thing to keep the nation solidified and homogeneous and strong. And I think that state's authoritarianism, that tradition still continues in Turkey, and it's continued all the way. But what happened was, I just said the second line was crushed. You know, the more conservative/liberal line, if you will, was crushed in 1925, but it didn't die, of course. And Turkey had its first fair and free elections. Well, we had elections in the Ottoman time, but in the Republican time. The first and free elections was held in 1950. And what happened in 1950? The party which represented that conservative/liberal line came to power with the motto, "Enough, the nation has the word." Because that's interesting, because the nation has the word is an interesting phenomenon. Because in the 30s, the CHP elites defined themselves as a government for the people, in spite of the people. I mean, that's different from, for example, the American way of speaking, where government of the people, for the people, by the people. This was in spite of the people. So the opposition, which was crushed, came back under the name Democratic Party, and they came with a great vote because people were fed up with this authoritarian tradition. And they won 3 elections in a row. All the 1950s to 60s was under this Democratic Party. Under which Turkey thrived. We got the first foreign investment, there was a Marshall Plan, American money came in, Turkey became a member of the NATO. The economy really made a great progress. And what happened? Well, in 1960, the military staged a military coup. Because the Republic was going in the wrong way. It was diverging from the original line. They executed the prime minister and 2 of his ministers after a short trial, and they again restored order. And then we had military coups and indirect coups, and it still goes on in Turkey. And this dichotomy between this authoritarian state tradition and, of course, the part of the society which likes that, because when you have an authoritarian regime, some people like it because they benefit from that, but the bigger part of society doesn't like that. So you have this dichotomy between this authoritarian state tradition and the political party which represents that, the CHP. And on the other hand, you have this conservative/liberal/Kurds/pious Muslims and all this big chunk of people who just want a more open system, a more open regime. Interestingly, liberals have been very influential in this battle because they create the firepower intellectually. They just create the ideas in which conservatives are getting more and more interested. And I think thanks to this tradition, right now, we are having a very interesting synthesis of Islam and liberalism in Turkey, which I think is a promising thing for the whole of the world. That's another issue which you and I can touch upon. And I think Professor Yayla is very influential in creating this synthesis in Turkey. Should thankful to him. Okay. A lot of questions, speech about these, and maybe I should talk on the Kurds a little bit. And, well, I think this background can give us some ideas, but if you speak specifically on the Kurds, I think the Kurdish issue is important because it is a case study of this authoritarian tradition. It's a case study which shows that how this authoritarian tradition really harmed Turkey's efforts for modernization or creating a real point. Beyond that part, the Kurds were there, they were polar, and after the Kurds were signing a petition, and meeting to solve the because they were trying to be on Persians, they were assuming they were going to get part of the power, they don't get right over. And I don't think that the autonomous system, they had no offensive oil and fuel wars, but that's based on the law from India. So there was this kind of political autonomy of Kurds. And that way also means the Kurds are a nation that exists in their own trades. They are closer to Persia than they are to the Turkish. So they're not ethnic enough. But the fact that they are not the Kurds really has unified for them. full nation. Anyway, this is something about literally something else. And under the last day of the war, there were 12 clubs, there was fighting against the Kurdistan, there was actually the club called that. But when the Turks out in the as I said, the federal policy field, they thought that kind of blew of interest. Again, the idea of identity of society, that is a cycle for division and then destruction. Which is not the same, yes, I mean, different identities led this into a virus in a national context. But before there are accepting things, so maybe you should how you look at that, should you conclude that you should wipe out the identities, or you should say you should calculate and set this up, but it's on the basis of the national context. In a hundred exactly of the CDs, basically called this, what we have to first. And they started, in 1995, there was a revolt after the revolt, the establishment of the authoritarian nation. Kurds went to advance. And it is legal to speak Kurdish. And from in the article, places where like, not only here, they got to the Kurdish, people going back and saying, Southern Turkish. You don't understand it, but this is very helpful. So many institutions like that, school, institutions, and Kurds were told that they were West. The term mountain Kurd, not mountain Turks was there. So they actually were living in mountains all the time, they built language you should say it wrong, and you can't say that. It's a few years created the roots of Kurds in Malaysia, and which relates to Western national state. So Turkey fought to drive over Kurds. And like when you look at it, it wasn't Kurds, it became built from Kurds. President yes, and just as foreign parties. In all of the there's this famous law. The most is how happy is one who's at Turk. That's the training money story. How happy is one who's at Turk. But the wall is protected by barbed wire from the presidency who did bombing and that was written on every mountain, every hill, and like in east and trying to convert it. Now, this was not yet. There was no well, these are like trying to know something when it was built trains and roads, like foster this was private with a national party. You can't get it all. So they won't terrorists, they can't accept words, they can't pay language. So instead of just something you put right, let's get states. Like we're making culture, or that's a drawing Egypt. That's really that's family and systems of irrigation was just a lot. We only going to that's working. We see that in the year of 2000, ever in history. And then after in 2002, on the curve of KDP justice and the church slash law. We see more are happy to be in Turkey as citizens. People specific economic opportunities. But as a curve, they don't want to they must mind themselves they want. But they don't have to in order to just between the freedom and opportunities. As I just mentioned, the fact there was also Kurdish nationalism, and research nationalists especially like going across in the late 1960s and 70s, which was a big thing in the 1960s and 70s. Everybody who grew up like 90% of the so-called intellectuals were reading Mustafa Akyol in the first place, or a summary of Mustafa Marxists. What Reagan called the opium of intellectuals was very, very powerful in Turkey. And that Marxist trend created some Marxist terror organizations, and one of them was heavily also influenced by the Kurdish identity. That one, the PKK, Kurdish Communist Party, turned into a terrorist organization, and it is leading a war against the Turkish government since 1984, and they killed so many people, so that's a terrorist organization. So, and which needs to be denounced definitely. So, of course, the Turkish state has some justification in this trend, in the sense that, I mean, yes, you suppressed the population and you created a problem, but then this doesn't justify terrorism. Turkey cannot go on with this way of events. The only way is trying to make more than by people their lives, by all Marxist push, and yes, you're quite right, but minimizing the nationality, and the same thing for other systems. They're always much more important doing that. And countries, if they are resentments based on policy, they tend to agree with the war. We can win that greater population, but we flip and over the story. You can't win all the interest of one. I think after that stage, in recent elections in 2007, this conservative/liberal governing party, the AKP, won 55% of the Kurdish votes, whereas the Kurdish nationalists gained 25% of the votes, with about 30% in the southeast. Which shows that not all Kurdish nationalists were dying to create a Kurdish state. Many of them are not. And many of them are happy in Turkey, which is liberal. But of course, the bad news is that that party is now being tried to close down by the Constitutional Court, which is the hair of that tradition, state tradition, which crushes any reach into ideology. And that's going to have to finish my time. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.